Good afternoon, a very warm welcome to Nesta and to this Nesta Talks To event with Jaideep Prabhu. If you don't know Nesta yet, then we are the UK's social innovation, and I'm one of the leadership team here at Nesta. I'm Vicky Selleck, looking after much of our work on partnerships with other people, including many in the public sector. Nesta has been around for about 20 years, so a little bit of time, but we and our current guys, our new 10-year strategy is really focusing and honing in on how to give children the very best start in life in those early years, to give everyone a fairer start, a more equitable start. We're thinking also about healthy life years and how we can increase the number of healthy life years that everyone in the UK experiences. And finally, focusing in on decarbonisation, particularly of homes, as we pursue a more sustainable future. So those three missions we'll be working on for the next 10 years. And we'd love to collaborate where possible with people working on the front line, with communities, with colleagues in the governments in the nations of the UK. So if that's you and you want to find out more, then do get in touch with us. But our focus today is thinking about how governments should innovate. And I'm delighted that we're joined by Jaideep Prabhu, who teaches business and marketing at the Cambridge Business School at the University of Cambridge. And today he's going to share with us some of his insights over his career of how you can really think through an innovation process, and particularly what we can learn from government innovators around the world and how we can apply that to our own innovation system. And that is whether you are a politician, whether you work in government, whether you work in the community sector, the charity sector, whether you're merely an interested citizen, what role should we each play in this ecosystem, and how can governments really grasp hold of innovation? The format today is he's going to share a little bit more for us, give us some food for thought directly. Then we've got an opportunity to have a conversation, and that can be a conversation between me and him, but I really hope that you will join in at home and make this a multiple conversation. So you will see that there's a button at the bottom of your screen for Q&A. If you want to ask Jaideep a question, that is the place to drop your question in. Do that at any time whilst he's talking or I'm talking, and we will make sure we ask those questions as we go through. And equally, if you want to chat, if you want to ask a question about the format, or you want to find out some more information about who else is listening in this afternoon, then you can do that in the button that's marked chat. Little thing will appear on the side of your screen. And you can introduce yourself to others or explain why you're fascinated by something Jaideep's just said or intrigued. So do get chatting away there, and we'll make sure we can make this as interactive as possible. If you want closed captions during the event, there's information in the chat now for how to get hold of that. That will give you live captions so you can read them on the screen. But let's get going, I think. Jaideep, I know that you have been an author of many books on innovation. I was delighted to read your most recent one, particularly after you pursued this whole area of frugal innovation and spoken indeed at Nesta and in places around the world about it. So tell us a little bit more about how governments can and should innovate.
Thank you so much, Vicky. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and audience members. So thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you so much, everyone, for listening in. So as Vicky said, I have a presentation. I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes about this book that I've just published called How Should a Government Be? The New Levers of State Power. So as Vicky mentioned, I'm a professor of business. I work in a business school, and I've studied innovation mainly in the private sector. That's been my focus. And I've been particularly interested in this notion of frugal innovation, where we see, particularly over the last decade or so, small teams now able to do things that only large companies or big government labs could have done before. And I've studied how these teams are developing highly affordable solutions, faster, better, and cheaper around the world across sectors, from financial services to healthcare, education, energy, and so on. And often these solutions are designed to address social problems that impinge on public services and the state. So we see this phenomenon in various areas. We see it in software. So WhatsApp, for instance, was famously built by 4 people in less than a year with about 250,000 in seed funding. It went on to create huge value for hundreds of millions of people who routinely use the app. And of course, it created value for the founders who then sold it to Facebook for almost $20 billion. So we see this in software, but we see this phenomenon in hardware as well. The Raspberry Pi, something that was developed by a former student of ours in Cambridge, a mature student, Eben Upton, who was doing an executive MBA while he was teaching computer science in the university. And he and his colleagues came up with this very basic computer. You see him holding this microprocessor called the Raspberry Pi, initially designed for school children, to help them to tinker with hardware, play with it, and also to learn to code. And they thought they'd sell a few thousand units. They've sold several million, often to the parents and the dads who in maker spaces, in this maker community, are designing, developing not only prototypes, but sometimes open source hardware solutions to problems that they see in their community. We see this phenomenon in the developing world. This was a service called M-Pesa, introduced by Vodafone in Kenya in 2007, which would enable a lady like this from rural Kenya to use her basic phone, not only to talk to her son who might be working in Nairobi and earning an income, but also to ask him to send money home in a crisis, which he could do by texting it to her, which she would then receive as e-float onto her phone, and then she could cash in her local corner shop, which would be an M-Pesa agent. And this was frugal financial inclusion, bringing people who are outside the banking system into the formal system through mobile phones and corner shops. So we see this in the developing world, but we see this phenomenon in the developed world as well. So this is a startup called Cellscope, spun out of the University of California at Berkeley, and they make a suite of medical devices that essentially leverage the computing power of your smartphone and its connectivity to do telemedicine. So this is an otoscope, which just plugs into the audio jack of your phone, and the mother can use it to take very high resolution pictures of the inner ear of her daughter when she has an infection and send the images to a consultant who's somewhere else. This device is a fraction of the cost of the standalone device. And of course, it enables telemedicine. So this is really a global and pretty ubiquitous phenomenon. And I was fascinated by it, and I wrote 2 books about this with co-authors. This first book called Jugaad Innovation is very much about this phenomenon in emerging markets like India. Jugaad is the Hindi word that sort of describes this kind of frugal, affordable innovation. This book came out in 2012. And after it came out, there was a lot of interest in this idea of frugal innovation in the West for the West. So we wrote a follow-up book in 2015 called Frugal Innovation, which looked at how not only startups, but large Western companies were adopting this approach to innovation within their organizations. And over the years, I've talked to various audiences about the ideas in these books, about the stories in these books. And whenever I did that, wherever I was, invariably somebody in the audience would ask me, so what does this mean for governments? And so I began to think about that question. And I realized there were 2 aspects to this. One was the aspect of what it meant for the government itself and its operations internally, how it could do its own business better, faster, cheaper, how it could deliver services to citizens in this highly affordable, frugal way. But there was also this other aspect I realized, which was what was the government's role in managing this phenomenon in the economy more generally? How should governments regulate this kind of innovation, and how should they cultivate it? And so I ended up writing this book. 5 years later, it came out. How should a government be? And when I was researching the book, I obviously had to think about this question and realized that others, of course, had been thinking about this question for a while. There was at least 100 years of debate about how a government should be. And there are perhaps 2 polar opinions on that question. On the one hand, you have those you might call libertarians, but generally skeptical of governments and think that they are inefficient and ineffective at best, and at worst are actually dangerous if they have too much power. And on the other hand, you have statists who are more sanguine about the role of government, and they think that governments are really the only force that can redress some of the vagaries and injustices of nature or the market. And of course, like any polar opinions, there's an element of truth to both positions. I mean, of course, governments can be inefficient and ineffective, but equally, they often have a crucial role to play. So the question I ask is one of, which is in the middle ground between the two, which is, if governments are to be efficient and effective, how might they do that? And how might they do that without trampling on our freedoms? Not only in times of stability, but also in times of crisis, like now in a pandemic. And I don't just aim to answer this question in the abstract. I very much want to look at actual cases of governments doing this around the world. So I start with a case from a country I know fairly well, India, and a project that I've studied over the years, this project of giving every Indian a unique ID, a 12-digit number linked to their fingerprints, the irises of their eyes, and a few demographic questions. And the Indian government initiated this process in 2009 and invited somebody from the private sector, the CEO and one of the co-founders of India's largest software company, Infosys, to come into the government and to drive this project from within. And it's been fairly successful. In less than 5 years, they were able to issue over 1 billion IDs. Almost every Indian now has one of these, and at less than $1 per ID. And interestingly, in the very first year when the government introduced this, used this ID and linked it to its various benefit schemes like food subsidies and cooking gas subsidies and other benefits, they were able to save in 1 year more than the entire program cost, because they were able to eliminate these ghost beneficiaries, fraud in the system, fake IDs that were drawing down benefits that were meant for someone else, who was then, of course, denied these benefits. And so I argue in the book that this project is an example of how governments, even a country like India, can be efficient and effective. And I look at how that was done. But of course, there were problems that arise from this. There were problems of the privacy of the data and the security of the data. And civil society had to step in to ensure that citizens were protected. The press was very important in raising these issues. Activists were very important in bringing them to the attention of various authorities. And eventually the judiciary had to step in, and the Supreme Court had to rule on the legal and constitutional application of this ID versus those applications that were not constitutional. I then turn to another very large developing country, China, and I look at the social credit system, which is a national program there that aims to give every citizen and business a score, a credit score, based on their economic and social behavior. Now, we are familiar with credit scores in the West. We do that, for financial behavior and so forth. But the Chinese system aims to be more expansive, potentially more intrusive. They will also look at your personal behavior, like your online behavior, or your behavior in public spaces, like in public transport and so on. And then your rating will have real consequences. So if you have a good rating, then you will get access to loans and that sort of thing. If you have a bad rating, then you may be denied access to loans, but also to the public school system and transport, mobility, things like that. Now, interestingly, this program seems to be quite popular with Chinese citizens. A 2018 survey found that 80% of the respondents had actually joined a commercial social credit system, but only about 7% were aware that it was also part of a government system. At any rate, the majority approved of it because they felt this would police bad behavior and ensure accountability from individuals and businesses. But we can see how something like this could, if it was linked to things like visual surveillance and so on, secret cameras and all that kind of stuff, then this could potentially be very intrusive. Particularly in an authoritarian state, it could be used against minority groups and so on. So, we see that governments now around the world have the potential to do more and better with less, but there are also potentially alarming aspects of this. And in some ways, the situation we face today is a bit like in the 30s when the world was dealing with the aftermath of the Great Depression, and we had these competing state systems from around the world. And in 36, Keynes wrote, and this is when we had the Soviet Union, we had Nazi Germany, and we had the New Deal in the US. He wrote that the authoritarian state systems of today seem to solve the problem of unemployment at the expense of efficiency and freedom, but it may be possible by a right analysis to cure the disease whilst preserving efficiency and freedom. And it's really that balance between effectiveness, efficiency, and freedom that I look at in the book. And I argue that governments today, much like companies, have access to new technologies, some of these ubiquitous, and forms of organization that can help them to be far more efficient and effective. However, if they're also to guarantee our freedoms, the privacy and security of our data, they need to adopt 5 principles. They need to be responsive to citizens, putting citizens first and at the heart of what they do. They need to be inclusive and balance the competing interests of groups of citizens. They need to be experimental, constantly trying out new ideas, testing them, gathering evidence, and then scaling them. They need to be entrepreneurial, being proactive to engage with new technologies and new players in these areas. And finally, governments need to be truly innovative and create a culture of innovation throughout the government structure. I end the book by arguing that citizens too have a role in holding their governments to account, ensuring that their governments adhere to these principles in how they operate. So let me quickly walk you through these principles. And in each of the cases, I have typically 1 or 2 cases that I look at of the application of these principles. So the responsive state, I look at how governments can be citizen-centric and how they can work outside in from the perspective of the citizen rather than inside out from the perspective of the bureaucracy in designing and delivering solutions to people. I argue that that governments can involve citizens in that process. And I look at public services, particularly social care, and this example of Buurtzorg, a Dutch organization that has really revolutionized social care in the Netherlands and elsewhere by developing their whole organization around the patient and the nurse and that relationship. I then turn to how states can be inclusive and balance the needs of different groups of citizens. I look at how Denmark over many decades has implemented this idea of flexicurity, which balances the flexibility that employers seek in the labor market with the security that job seekers seek in the market. I also look at new ideas like the universal basic income and related schemes. And I report that in theory, there are pros and cons of something like the UBI. You can see merits in it, you can see why it might not work. And the key question, therefore, is what happens in practice when we actually apply it? And that leads me to my next principle, which is the experimental state, and how governments need to constantly be trying new ideas in pilots to reduce the risk of failure, evaluating them, assessing them for what works and what doesn't, and then scaling them if they're deemed to work. So this is evidence-based policy. And here I look at the behavioral insights team here in the UK, which Nesta owns a part of, and also the What Works networks, which gather and disseminate information on what works in areas like education, criminal justice, and so on. So those 3 principles that I've just covered are really about how the state should do its own work. I then turn to how the state should manage the economy, and I start with regulation. And I argue that here states need to be entrepreneurial in the sense of being proactive and engaging early with new technological opportunities and new players involved in those opportunities. I look at how the Kenyan Central Bank played this role in the case of that service I mentioned earlier, M-Pesa. How they were able to work with independent consultants to assess the benefits of the system, but also potential downsides and ensure that this could flourish even while citizens were protected. I also look at autonomous vehicles in the US, across states, and in the UK, where regulation has been put into place, a very open, light touch regulation to enable various players to try out autonomous vehicles, sometimes on our city streets, to get data and to understand what works and what doesn't, while ensuring protection of ordinary citizens. The state can also be entrepreneurial in how it cultivates this kind of innovation in the economy. This is what we might call industrial strategy. And I return to the case of autonomous vehicles. And again, I look at how in the UK, the government has created small pots of money and challenges to encourage all the various players who might potentially play in the autonomous vehicle space to come together, to partner, collaborate, test out new technologies, see what works, what doesn't, and then go forward. And so we see large and small auto companies working with software and telecoms companies, insurance companies, universities, and cities. I also look at how the US in particular, how NASA is working with large private sector companies like SpaceX to achieve its objectives of going to the moon and Mars. And I look at how cities like Barcelona are working with communities of makers. I mentioned the maker movement and maker spaces using open source hardware and software. And Barcelona have done that very well to encourage local manufacturing and creativity in the city. And my overall argument here is that governments should really play the role of steering these players rather than trying to do the heavy lifting and the rowing themselves. The government should be very aware of what others can do better and find ways to encourage them to do that and enable them to do that rather than trying to do the work itself. And then finally, this principle of how a government can be innovative throughout, how governments can create a culture of innovation within government, which encourages people to take a bit of risk, try out new ideas, and then scale them. I look at this at the level of the city. I look at how Boston, the mayor of Boston has created a unit called the Office of New Urban Mechanics that does specifically this. They work with other players, startups, and universities to identify new potential solutions to problems in the city. They test them, and then when they think that they're ready to scale, they hand it over to the relevant department to scale it. I look at how this is done at different levels in Canada, at the city level, the provincial level, and the federal level, and how as you go from the city to the federal level, it gets harder to create this culture of innovation because of the complexity and the quite rigid structures that you have. And I look at the case of Bangladesh, where over the last 10 years or so, a UNDP-led program called Access to Information, a kind of digitization initiative, has achieved a lot in terms of changing the mindset of bureaucrats and civil servants. So the initial effort was to look at quick wins, small things that could make a big difference to citizens, typically using digital solutions. But then they went further and now have a program of training for civil servants, particularly training them to empathize deeply with citizens by role-playing, going to government departments as citizens to try and get a government service, and then reflecting on their experience to understand how that process might be simplified, how unnecessary steps may be eliminated, and some could be digitized. And the objective always is to be able to measure the impact. So they have a framework called TCV, which attempts to measure the time that any government service cost takes for a citizen to access, the cost to the citizen, and the number of visits. And they aim to reduce all three to make citizens' lives better. And then, as I said, I turned to a final chapter on the role of citizens. How can they hold governments to account? And of course, they must be engaged and informed. I look at how they can choose leaders and teams better. And I argue that, of course, this shouldn't only happen during the time of elections, but between elections. Through civil society, people from outside government can put pressure on government. But best of all, perhaps they should go to work for government and change it from within. So that's my book in a nutshell. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back to Vicky for our conversation.
Thank you, Jaideep. Really helpful. And a great sort of synopsis with lots of points we can jump in on. So I wonder whether you might start by talking about experimentalism. It's something I've been thinking a lot about recently as Nesta shifts from being a supporter of innovation from the outside to partnering with a smaller number of people and running lots of experiments, particularly sort of rapid trials. Tell us, where have you seen that experimentalism sort of really take root in a government? Give us an example from around the world, and what are the sort of characteristics of that you think others can learn from?
Great question to get us started, Vicky. And it's happened right here in the UK. The UK has been a pioneer in the application of behavioral insights and the behavioral method, which is, as you know, experimental. Not just in areas like healthcare. Of course, that's where it originated, this idea of randomized controlled trials, which we know are very important now in a pandemic. If you want to assess the efficacy of a drug or a vaccine, you have to test it on healthy people. And then you have a control group, which gets a placebo. And of course, they're double blind and all these kinds of things. There's a very sophisticated methodology pioneered in healthcare to understand what works. And then you can give very clear guidance to people on which drugs to take when, what they can expect the side effects to be, and so forth. And the idea of the behavioral insights team is just to extend that to other areas of public service and public life. For instance, ensuring that people pay taxes on time. You can do that in a very light touch way, by sending them letters that are designed to nudge them to do the right thing. And what works really depends on how you design the letter. And of course, the theory might suggest various things like social influence. If you're a doctor, most other doctors tend to pay on time. So theoretically, we might expect different things to work and different wording to work. But the question is what actually works. And so you have to do the experiment. You come up with different letters, and you send them to different groups of people, and you have a control condition. And it doesn't cost a whole lot more to do that, because you're sending out these letters anyway. And then you look at the data as it comes in. You see who has responded better on time and so on. And you're able to measure very precisely what the effect has been or not been. And then that can guide your subsequent efforts. And you can extend this to many, many, many areas of public life. And so I think, there is a merit to not only experimentation in the sense of trying out something new, but also in the rigorous technical sense of being able to gather evidence as you do it of what works and what doesn't, by using this very rigorous kind of randomized controlled trial approach. And as I said, this has been pioneered here in the UK. The Behavioral Insights team was formed in the Cabinet Office as a skunk works. It then proved its case, because that's the beautiful thing about it, is when you've done a trial, you have the evidence and you can prove what the benefits to government are, what the costs and benefits are. It has scaled and then spun out of government, and Nesta, of course, is a part owner. Very interesting model, and now that idea spread to many other countries around the world. So that, in a nutshell, is how I view the experimental state.
Thank you. And there's a follow-up question from Soraya, who's asked in the Q&A. How do you think governments can partner with startups to be more experimental? Her point actually using the example of M-Pesa in Kenya, where actually that was brought forward by a big player rather than a startup. So do you think the government would have responded differently if it was a startup? But a sort of side point really to the main thrust, which is how can governments be an embracing partner with startups?
Great question from Soraya, and I think I might know Soraya. So that's a wonderful question. And yes, M-Pesa is very interesting for several reasons. One is that it was actually a joint venture between Vodafone and DFID. Some of the money for that experiment came from DFID. So that's an interesting part of it too, involving the public sector and cross-country. But you're right, the central bank in Kenya was probably assured or reassured by the fact that it was a big player. It was a major player and a multinational as well. So I think there was an element of trust there, that we can trust these people, even though they're a telecoms company, to come into something that's a banking service and so on. So what if it were a startup? And particularly when we are talking about things like fintech, central banks have had a sort of ambivalent relationship with fintech startups. On the one hand, they realize that these startups are very vigorous and vibrant and energetic and move faster and cheaper and all this stuff, and do things that banks are not willing to do or are slow to do. So there's that potential to tap into that energy, which can deliver benefits to people, financial inclusion and things like that. But on the downside, they're worried about systemic risk. What if one of these goes bust, or there are unintended negative consequences? Central banks are terrified of that, because of financial crises and and the knock-on effects. So, one way to deal with that is, again, the UK has pioneered this notion of a regulatory sandbox, where you essentially create a space, a safe space, a protected space, which is nevertheless real, for fintechs to introduce their service to customers, real customers, but in a non-systemic way, sort of de-linked from the rest of the financial system. They can try it out, and then in that way, both the fintech and the regulators understand what works and what doesn't. What are the positive benefits of this idea? What are some of the negative downsides? They can then make a decision to free up the fintech to scale it and give them permission to introduce it more generally. And of course, can regulate. They can require the fintech to report on findings in a regular way, weekly or so. This is what the central bank required Vodafone to do with M-Pesa as well. So I think that idea of engaging proactively early in a safe space to test it out, learn quickly, and then scale and regulate accordingly is the way to go. And again, we see that with autonomous vehicles and how various US states and the UK again have done something similar to engage not only with the large companies. They're very clear that they don't want to reinforce, in a sense, the hegemony or the monopolistic power of the large players. You want a level playing field because, yes, you need the large players to scale and so on, but you also get fresh ideas from startups, and you need both in a flourishing innovation ecosystem. So they have been very careful in the autonomous vehicles case to design these challenges and the funding to ensure participation from various different sectors and types of companies. And I think, again, that's the way to go.
It's a great example. And actually, one of the we're keen on as well at Nesta, we run a challenge prize center, which thinks particularly about how you can get innovators from all different sections of society to think up new solutions. Indeed, we ran an open sandbox challenge on open banking. But I think it's one of the spaces where you can see perhaps academics joining in and bringing research from their own labs, or your sort of inventor in the bathtub, I've got a great idea here, as well as people from industry and from startups, all sort of competing to offer a prize or a solution for a prize by offering different solutions. And I think that's probably one of the things that comes through in your book as a whole, is this sense that really the levers to any state are to be in as many fields as possible. So not just take the brain power of the civil servants, but to also link up with academia, to really listen to citizens deeply and to take their intelligence alongside that of steady professionals. Tell us a little bit more about that. Particularly, you might know a bit more about academia and some of the examples already you've mentioned, like in Boston, where they sort of created a lab, in effect, within government in order to be able to translate ideas from universities into everyday innovations for citizens. Tell us a bit more about that example, but also about how you open the system of government up to be able to hear many more voices.
Absolutely. And, I would say this as an academic, but I think universities and academics have an important role to play in this process, and have played a role in this process. But where the steering comes from the government, whether it's the city government or a state government or a national government. We see outstanding examples. I'll get to Boston in a second, but just, talking about the pandemic, we see precisely that happening. Where it's worked, it has involved these different players being steered or coordinated by the state. So, you see the University of Oxford come up with the vaccine. and in a controlled way, in a relatively small scale production. Wonderful, we could test it. But then you need the big company to come in, the big pharmaceutical company like AstraZeneca, which knows how, has the resources to do all the clinical trials at scale and convince regulators this is safe, do all the randomized controlled trials. Then they need to manufacture it at scale. Again, they bring their resources to bear on a global footing. And then you have the NHS to actually get the vaccine into arms. And all these players had to be coordinated, and the state had to do that. But the state didn't do the heavy lifting itself. The state could not have on its own come up with a vaccine, or should not, I think, do that kind of stuff. So I absolutely agree that principle of different players and the state knowing what the strengths of different parts of the economy are, encouraging them to flourish, giving them an opportunity to come together, sometimes through funding or a challenge, and then letting them get on with it. Coming to Boston, again, very good example there. Because in some ways, again, the universities in Boston played an important role. First, in producing that type of person who has an entrepreneurial mind and is a bit techie, someone who might have gone to work in a startup or a tech company, but was more public spirited in a way. And I see this with our students, and I think this is a global phenomenon, that they have these skills, but they often want to make a difference. And they see the public sector or the social space as being an interesting space to operate in, not just the private sector to operate in. And so Boston is very lucky to have many such institutions. Some of those people then went to work for the mayor's office because they felt they could make a difference, and then made a case to the mayor to set up this unit, a kind of skunk works within government, a bit like the behavioral insights team, to try out new ideas, often in partnership with the universities or with startups or bigger companies in the area, test them and then prove them and then hand them over to the relevant government department. So I think universities can play a very important role. I mentioned Barcelona and how the mayor's office there too has created this maker community of maker spaces, or fab labs, as they're called. Interestingly, the whole notion of a fab lab came out of an academic institution, MIT, from a course which was titled How to Make Almost Anything. They did that in MIT, and now there's a network of over 1,000 such fab labs around the world. Barcelona happens to have a network that's nurtured by the mayor's office. It came out of an academic institution in Barcelona as well, which were partners. And now in India, for instance, there's over 100 of these maker spaces that are open source manufacturing oxygen condenser kits to deal with the oxygen crisis in the pandemic. Just happened spontaneously, and is a new form of distributed open source manufacturing. So I think universities can play an important role in this process.
That is a fantastic set of examples as well, particularly leaning into COVID, both the incredible ability of government and AstraZeneca to partner quickly to create a vaccine, but also, as you say, those examples of maker labs being able to generate new products and replicate things in India. It's amazing how much we've seen innovation accelerate during this really, really difficult crisis. So thanks for sharing those. Actually, it's made me think, related to Sasha's question in the Q&A, so obviously COVID, there was a lot of misinformation spreading around. I can say, having had my vaccine yesterday, I don't think I do now have was it a Microsoft chip? Bill Gates is now spying on the world through vaccines. But this kind of misinformation appears all the time, whether it's 5G urban legends or Brexit buses, as Sasha says in the Q&A. How can governments really win that information battle and get objective information seen clearly, rather than just sort of political spin on things or even outright misinformation?
Again, a great question. And undoubtedly, there is a dark side to this phenomenon of frugal innovation. So I've painted mostly the bright side, the sunny uplands, but there are some dark sort of subterranean areas, one of which is to do with social media. And so social media platforms, as we know, have proliferated. I gave the example of WhatsApp, but there are, any number, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and so on. And of course, they brought huge value to people. I mean, without Facebook, a lot of small and medium-sized companies would not be able to advertise their products and sell them. And they're able to do that. And of course, it has also democratized news, authentic news and information. But it has also created this beast. This was probably unintended, unexpected consequence of creating fake news and making it so easy for it to spread. And so this is a classic example of what I cover in the chapter on regulation, of how technologies can go very fast these days. They can spread very fast. They can bring, great benefits. They can create jobs and, improve productivity, bring information, delight us and all this. But they will also have some unintended, unanticipated downsides. So how should a government view this? How can they ensure that these new technologies flourish and bring with them all the positive things they can, but mitigate against the downsides, like fake news and misinformation? And I think sometimes it's very hard to do it post fact. When it's now established that Facebook is the social media network, whatever, it's going to be very hard to break them up, and that's going to have negative consequences as well. So you have to be anticipatory in a sense, and you have to be able to see in advance what issues are causes for concern and how can you mitigate them. And this brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, which is this experimental approach, these regulatory sandboxes. Engage proactively early and give various players, large and small, from that sector, from outside the sector, opportunities to try it out, see what works technically and from a social and economic standpoint, and then get data, and then what the issues are. If it's going to cause unemployment, then you know that in advance. How will you retrain people? Because it might cause unemployment in one sector. Autonomous vehicles might result in a lot of taxi drivers or lorry drivers becoming redundant. How can they be retrained in some other area, like being operators in the back? So you may have a fleet of autonomous lorries, but you might still need an operator somewhere or operators somewhere to look after them and to look at the data coming in and so on. So how do you anticipate that? How do you retrain that? How do you get people to do it? And I think we need that kind of anticipatory, proactive approach on the part of governments.
Totally agree. Now, nice simple question for you here. Which is the most innovative government around the world, or most innovative governments? Maybe we'll allow you one or two. But also, is there a relationship between governments that are innovative and their citizens being happier, wealthier, more stable?
Again, a great question. And I think there are lots of organizations that actually rate governments on an annual basis. There are rankings. The OECD will have its ranking. The UN will have its ranking. The World Bank has its ranking. And of course, they look at different things. You can also just look at rankings of digital government. And I think the second part of your question anticipates the answer to the first one, because generally speaking, it's very hard to know which way the causality works, but these things tend to occur together. Healthy, happy societies and economies tend to have good governments and vice versa. And so there are the usual suspects. The Nordics always fare well, and there are typically the developed countries fare in the top. But it's some of the countries that I've studied I find surprisingly innovative against the odds, and I wanted to cover those contexts as well. So one that I don't write that much about, but others have written a lot about, is Estonia. And it's amazing how much they've achieved in a short period of time in terms of digitizing. Practically any government service is now available digitally. I was listening to a podcast by a senior civil servant from Estonia who said that you can now do your taxes online in under 2 minutes in Estonia, and they want to be able to bring it to under 1 minute. And the idea is that it should be a delight to do your taxes. Imagine that. And now, why Estonia? And you can even become a citizen of Estonia digitally, and you can, register your business wherever you are in the world, all this kind of stuff. Now, it's not an obvious country, if you think about digitalization, why Estonia? It was part of the Soviet bloc. But there were other countries that were part of the Soviet bloc, other Baltic states. So I think there are a particular set of circumstances. They had the human resources. They were also concerned about, being too much under the influence of the Soviets, and also remember the Soviet era. So, perhaps the conditions are right. Other countries, the UK does pretty well on digitalization of government. And I've given examples of, for instance, behavioral insights team, which I think is really innovative. Singapore comes up very often. Again, we have a program on technology policy at the business school for master students. We often have civil servants, practicing civil servants, young civil servants from Singapore come over, extraordinarily bright, very motivated, very public spirited, and very rational in their approach to government. So Singapore comes up. But I'd like to talk about, some of the non-obvious ones, India being one of them. I mentioned the unique ID project. I think that's a pretty innovative thing. Now, you're not going to see that across the board. You just have these few examples there. Bangladesh really was, to me, very surprising in a very positive way. This digital Bangladesh agenda, which then was linked to this UNDP-led program, Access to Information, I thought it's a very thoughtful, very deep and long-running program that has brought huge change to the bureaucracy. And actually, very interestingly, Bangladesh, when it started in 1971, over 40 years ago, was the second poorest country in the world. Throughout the 70s, they had very poor human development indicators and so on. And it now is much better off, and their human development indicators have caught up with some of their South Asian partners and exceeded them, child mortality and so on. And I think some programs like this are an important part of that. Kenya, I give the example of the central bank there playing this role. So I think you can find examples wherever you look of innovation in government. The question is, how can you make it systemic? The UAE is another very interesting example of a government that's obsessed with innovation and bring it into the heart, and actually the citizens' experience, ensuring that the citizens are delighted whenever they interact with their government, not just satisfied.
It's such a different kind of mind space to go into, isn't it? But it sounds completely fascinating. A really good question. So thank you to whoever asked that, but we don't have your name, but much appreciated. There's another question that's come in about the capabilities and skills that you need in-house. So we've talked a little bit about how you can work with academics or with citizens sort of in partnership, but what things do you really need in-house? And perhaps we saw an example during COVID. Test and Trace and the NHS app were not immediate successes. It cost a lot of money relying upon private sector consulting. Is that a good example of where we need to expand the skill set of civil servants?
Yeah, that's another great question. And yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to say, can you hear me? Because it says I'm muted, but the first thing to say is that obviously, as I said, governments should aim to steer and not row. So they shouldn't be aiming to do things that others in society can do better, just because that's what they do, But that doesn't mean that people in government shouldn't know a bit about technology, shouldn't know a bit about how business works or how the third sector works. And most importantly, it means that they should know how to bring all these players together. So they need to know a little bit about what they do and what makes them tick and how they speak and their mindset. But more importantly, they need to know how to bring these people together. And perhaps, Vicky, your title, it reflects that, right? Partnership officer. You need coordinating officers, partnership officers, and so on. And I think that sort of skill is crucial. And then it's these, what we might call soft skills. So yeah, you need to have some technical skills, but I think a lot of it is these soft skills of management and leadership and coordination and stakeholder management and so on. And also being entrepreneurial, by which I mean the ability to proactively identify problems, then proactively work with others, form teams, often small teams, cobble together these partnerships to find solutions, not create the solutions necessarily, find the solutions, and then enable them to happen. And I think nothing like a crisis to make that happen. I think that's how, and of course it worked well in some areas and not in others. Test and Trace didn't work. the vaccine worked. And again, then it's a question of who you bring in and how the team is led and managed and the incentives and so on. The Unique ID project in India is a good example of that. So I think partly why it worked was they had the right expertise come in. They had someone who knew it technically and from the business perspective, but was also publicly spirited and had worked enough with governments to know how governments worked. And then equally was supported from within the government because they had this trusting relationship. And then very quickly, he designed the whole sort of team to have two parts. One was the administrators who would be in Delhi and would understand how they would get the budgets together and motivate the government to do what it had to do. And then the technical team who would understand all the biometrics and the back end stuff, who were in Bangalore, and they were techies. And he was able to motivate people who came from some of the top tech companies in the world, to come and work as volunteers. And partly because of the technical challenge, the scale of it, but also because of what it could potentially do to really change society. And I think, that's what governments have. They have this ability to really make change and motivate people, a purpose that you might not find necessarily even in the largest private sector company or in an NGO. And so I think, one of the things I want to do in the book is to make the case for these sort of entrepreneurial people to come and work in government for government, not necessarily as career civil servants. You can even come and work on a project, and for governments to learn how to do that better, because that's a bit tricky, as we know. You can have special interests come in, you could dilute the public spirit, and so on. And the Boston example is very good because they choose that sort of technocrat, that the person who's entrepreneurial, a bit technical, to come into that particular unit. But they also want them to have some knowledge and concern about the state and the government and the public space. They don't want them to be cowboys. So that's the kind of skill set. And there are not that many people like that, I think.
We talked a little bit earlier about sort of mistrust, and there's a great question that's come in from Rosalind, who actually asked her question ages ago, but asked it in the chat and I couldn't find it again. So apologies, Rosalind, but it's about how citizens and governments can rebuild trust. And an important theme of your book was really that citizens have a role to play, right, in keeping politicians to account, but also in contributing their own ideas. So what sort of ideas are there for both increasing participation, but doing that where trust is built rather than just sort of participation, but at loggerheads?
Another really meaty question there, really brilliant questions coming in. The whole area of trust and citizens' participation. And, actually earlier, the question about misinformation, asked that question as well, because, and we discussed it from the perspective of the government, but I think citizens have a role to play in that misinformation game by themselves not playing the game, if you see what I mean, of being watchful about and being critical about what they see online and not passing stuff on that is clearly questionable. And if they pass it on, making clear that this is questionable and we don't know where it's come from. And there are some platforms like WhatsApp, you don't know where it's come from. Somebody could have just seeded it with malintent, and then you as a citizen could be enabling them by passing it on. So I think citizens have a huge, huge role to play. And the whole question of trust is a fascinating one. That relationship between that social contract, that famous thing between the state and the citizen, where as citizens, we give up some of our freedom to the state in order to get other things in return. And that's constantly being negotiated and renegotiated. And speaking of trust, there are these annual surveys, of how much people trust different institutions in their society. There's one called the Edelman's survey that's done annually. It's been done across many countries for a couple of decades now. And they ask people, they assess people's trust in government, in businesses, in NGOs, and in the media. And it's very interesting that governments tend to come at the bottom of that list in many countries and consistently. And they delve deeper and they find that businesses, for instance, are often more trusted than governments, surprisingly. But there are two components to it. So trust seems to be based on competence of that institution and their integrity. And governments tend to do worse than businesses on competence, but they do better on integrity, generally speaking. It can vary across countries. So for me, competence is a key issue. And a lot of my book is concerned with how can states be simply more competent? How can they do what they're supposed to do faster, better, cheaper? And I think a lot of that is being responsive to citizens, placing citizens first, changing the mindset from we're here to control you to we're here to make your lives better and easier, and so on. Estonia being an example of how that was done, moving from the Soviet system to one which was much more participatory and transparent and flat and so on. That's one way to do it. And I think that if governments were able to do that, they would be generally trusted more, and we would have a better relationship with governments. But of course, if you don't trust your government or you want to hold them to account, it's easier now to protest. The question is, how can that make positive change, as you said? And I think that sometimes people could protest for the sake of protesting and nothing really gets done. In fact, it might make the situation worse, which is why I sort of end the book with a plea to particularly young people to go and work in government. It's an exciting place to work. I say this as an academic, but I see civil servants, especially those who are trying to make change happen. It's a very noble profession, and it's also a challenging and interesting one. And I think in many states now that are very competent and innovative, they have been able to convince the brightest to come and work for them.
Yeah, a great plea. Definitely one that I echo. I see lots of fantastic collaborators in government. As you say, it gets a bad rep, whereas actually it's a pretty fun place to work. So we've got just 2 minutes left. So I've probably got time to ask you one last question, answered briefly. But Vidal has a fantastic question. So asking, how should government approach different types of innovation? Because often we talk about innovation as this single concept, but actually it could be exploitation, do things better, or it could be exploration, do things differently. What if you've got tensions from different competing innovation agendas? So how can government both manufacture those different innovation challenges, but also then manage the tensions where they're acting against each other?
What a great question. And, we could, again, spend a long time talking about just that one. But very quickly, I think, if the government can afford it, they need both. You need the exploration and you need the exploitation. The exploration can be expensive and risky and time consuming. It's long term, you don't know where it'll end, like the space race or something like that. These are long term projects, they're expensive, they're blue sky. And sometimes they're best left to academics or even large companies to do. Unless there's clearly market failure, you might just leave companies to do it or the universities to do it. Whereas the frugal stuff is something that governments, anywhere could do and ought to, because there are pressures. Citizens are telling them, we want this, we want this service done faster, better, cheaper, whatever it is, a passport or a visa service or a driver's license application. And that's something that can be done quickly by governments and relatively affordably. So, I would say that they should do more frugal innovation.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Jaideep. And I know this has been a short time, but you've given us a real global tour with examples from around the world. Certainly some genuine food for thought this lunchtime. And more information can, of course, be found in your new book, which is out now and available to purchase. If you want to talk more about government innovation, whether it is in frugal innovation or thinking through autonomous vehicles or anticipatory regulation, Nesta would also love to talk to you. Great, there it is. There's the book. If you would be kind enough to fill in our feedback survey afterwards, there'll be a link in the chat just now. Tell us what you enjoyed about the event, what you'd like to see more of, what you'd like to see Jaideep talk about in the future. That would be great. So thank you all for joining. Thanks for your fantastic questions and making this really interactive. And thank you, Jaideep, for giving up your time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Vicky, and your colleagues at Nesta for organizing this. And thank you, everyone, for joining. The questions were absolutely brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And thank you, Vicky, for managing it so well.
Superb. Thank you all.